The small voice cut through the evening air like a whisper that refused to be ignored. A little girl stood at the kitchen door, her clothes hanging loose on her thin frame, her eyes fixed somewhere near the ground. Her lips trembled as she forced the words out, each syllable cracking under the weight of hunger and shame. "Please, Mum, could I have some old bread?" The world seemed to stop. The woman in the maid's uniform, who had been wiping down the counter with practiced efficiency, went completely still. Her cloth fell from her hand and landed softly on the marble surface. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Her fingers began to shake first, subtle tremors that spread up through her wrists and into her shoulders. Then her eyes lifted to meet the child's face, and something inside her chest collapsed. It wasn't anger that flooded her expression. It wasn't annoyance at being interrupted or irritation at another beggar at the door. It was something far more dangerous and far more painful. It was recognition, the kind that reaches into your past and drags forward memories you've spent years trying to bury. Her pupils widened as she stared at the girl, searching her features with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The child had no idea who she was really speaking to. She didn't know the storm she had just unleashed or the truth that was about to unravel in that quiet kitchen. She was just a hungry girl asking for scraps. But what would happen next would change everything. For both of them. This wasn't the first door the girl had knocked on today. It wasn't even the 10th. Her small feet had carried her through the wealthier neighborhoods since dawn, past iron gates and manicured gardens that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. She had learned the hard way that asking for money was pointless. People's faces would harden the moment they heard the word, their eyes would narrow with suspicion, and the doors would close before she could finish her sentence. So she'd adjusted her approach. She didn't ask for much anymore, just the old bread, the stale loaves that bakeries threw away, the crusts that families scraped off their plates, leftovers, scraps, anything. The truth was simple and brutal. She had been alone for longer than she could properly remember. There had been a time, distant and hazy now, when she'd had someone, a face that smiled at her, hands that were warm. But that memory had faded like morning fog, and what remained was the cold reality of survival. She had no home to return to at night, no bed that waited for her, no voice calling her name. The streets had become her guardian, and they were cruel teachers. They taught her to move quickly, to stay quiet, and to never expect kindness. Her stomach had stopped growling 2 days ago. That was when the hunger moved past discomfort and into something else entirely, a hollow ache that made her dizzy when she stood too quickly. She'd found half an apple yesterday in a trash bin behind a restaurant, and she'd eaten it so fast she barely tasted it. Today she'd found nothing. The rejections had piled up like stones in her chest. One woman had shooed her away with a broom. A man had threatened to call the authorities. A teenage boy had laughed at her, mimicking her voice in a cruel sing-song tone that still echoed in her head. She had learned to make herself small. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on shoes or pavement or the gap between door and frame. Eye contact invited questions she couldn't answer, and attention she couldn't afford. It made people uncomfortable, made them see her as a person rather than a problem, and that always made things worse. So she kept her gaze down, her voice soft, her presence as unobtrusive as possible. She had become an expert at disappearing while still standing right in front of someone. The exhaustion was bone deep now. Her legs trembled not just from hunger, but from the endless walking, the constant movement from one rejection to the next. She'd developed a mental map of which neighborhoods were worth trying and which ones would only waste her energy. She knew which houses had dogs that barked and which ones had people who might on a generous day offer something. This particular street had been on her list for weeks, but she'd been too afraid to try it. The houses here were too grand, too polished, too far removed from anything she understood. But desperation has a way of eroding fear. When your stomach is empty enough and your options have run dry, even the most intimidating doors start to look possible. So she'd walked up the pristine driveway, her dirty shoes leaving faint marks on the stone path, and made her way to the kitchen entrance. Servants' doors were always safer than front doors. The people who answered them understood work and hardship in ways the wealthy never would. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that this house was the last place she should have stopped. That behind that door stood someone whose entire world was about to crack open. that her simple request for old bread would set in motion a series of events that had been waiting years to unfold. The girl was just trying to survive another day. She had no idea she'd just walked into the one place where her past and present were about to collide with devastating force. No idea that the woman staring at her with trembling hands held secrets that would rewrite everything she thought she knew about herself. She was just a hungry child at a kitchen door, unaware that fate had finally caught up to her. To anyone passing through the household, the woman in the maid's uniform was practically invisible. She wore the standard attire, a simple grey dress with white trim, an apron tied neatly at her waist, her hair pulled back in a practical bun that revealed a face that had learned to show nothing. She moved through the grand house with the kind of efficiency that came from years of practice, her footsteps quiet on marble floors, her presence so unobtrusive that guests often forgot she was in the room. She was the kind of person who blended into the background of wealthy lives, noticed only when something needed to be cleaned or served or managed. But those who worked alongside her knew better. The other staff members treated her with a certain deference that went beyond her official position. There was something in the way she carried herself, a quiet dignity that didn't match the uniform she wore. Her hands, though work-worn, moved with a grace that suggested a different history. Her speech, when she bothered to use it, was precise and educated in a way that raised questions no one dared to ask. The household respected her, relied on her, but they also understood instinctively that she was not quite what she appeared to be. She was overlooked by the family she served, but never quite forgotten by those who worked beside her. Now, as she stood frozen in the kitchen, every careful mask she'd constructed over the years threatened to shatter. Her eyes moved across the girl's face with an intensity that was almost surgical, cataloguing every feature, every angle, every tiny detail. She wasn't looking at the child the way most people looked at beggars, with pity or disgust or uncomfortable guilt. She was searching for something specific, and the desperation in that search was written in every line of her body. The girl kept her eyes down, unaware of the scrutiny, but the maid's gaze never wavered. She noticed things that no casual observer would have caught. The way the girl's left ear was slightly higher than her right, an asymmetry so subtle it would be meaningless to anyone else. The small scar just above her right eyebrow, a thin white line that could have come from any childhood accident. The shape of her hands, delicate and long-fingered, despite the dirt caked under her nails. These were details that meant nothing in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that made the maid's heart hammer against her ribs. Then her eyes caught on something that made her breath stop entirely. Around the girl's neck, barely visible beneath the collar of her ragged dress, was a thin cord. It was so worn and dirty that it nearly blended with her skin, but there was something attached to it. The maid's hand moved instinctively toward her own throat, where beneath her own uniform collar she wore something similar. She couldn't see what hung from the girl's cord, not yet, but the very fact that it existed sent a shock of recognition through her system that was almost physical in its intensity. Her mind was racing now, pulling up memories she'd tried to bury, comparing them against the evidence standing before her. She calculated ages in her head, counted backward through years of separation and loss. The timeline fit, the features fit. Even the posture, that particular way the girl held her shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller, triggered something ancient and painful in the maid's memory. But she couldn't be certain. Not yet. Hope was a dangerous thing, and she'd learned through bitter experience not to trust it too quickly. The maid forced herself to breathe, to slow the racing of her pulse, to think clearly through the fog of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. She needed to be sure. She needed confirmation beyond the physical similarities, beyond the coincidence of a necklace, beyond the way her entire body was screaming that this moment was significant. Because if she was wrong, if this was just another hungry child with features that happened to echo someone from her past, then acknowledging it would tear open wounds that had barely healed. And if she was right, if this truly was who she suspected it might be, then everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd lost, every careful plan she'd laid over the years would suddenly snap into sharp and terrifying focus. There was a reason this moment felt familiar, painfully familiar. It echoed something from long ago, a scene that had played out in a different kitchen, in a different life, when she'd been the one offering comfort and the world had still made sense. Before everything had been taken from her, before she'd been forced to disappear into this uniform and this role, hiding in plain sight while she waited for a chance that seemed less likely with every passing year. She'd spent so long searching, following threads that led nowhere, chasing shadows and rumors and false hopes. She'd almost given up, almost convinced herself that the past was truly gone, and that survival meant accepting her new reality. And now this child stood at her door, asking for bread with a voice that cracked in all the familiar ways, wearing something around her neck that might be the answer to years of desperate questions. The maid's hands were still trembling, but she forced them to move. She needed to handle this carefully. She needed to know the truth before she allowed herself to feel anything. Because if this moment was what she thought it was, then everything was about to change in ways she'd barely dared to imagine. The maid's hands moved almost without conscious thought, reaching for the bread basket on the counter. But then she paused, her fingers hovering over the older loaves at the bottom, the ones the girl had asked for. The old bread, the leftovers, the scraps that would normally go to the chickens or the compost bin. Something inside her rebelled against that choice. This child, whoever she was, whatever connection she might or might not have to the maid's past, deserved more than garbage. Deserved more than the bare minimum required to silence hunger for a few hours. She pulled out a fresh loaf instead, one that had been baked that morning for the family's dinner. The crust was still firm, the inside soft and yielding when she pressed her thumb against it. She could feel the girl's eyes on her now, confused by the delay, probably expecting rejection or some lecture about begging at wealthy homes. But the maid said nothing. She simply took the bread to the cutting board and sliced off 3 generous pieces, thick enough to be substantial, the kind of portions that spoke of nourishment rather than charity. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She carried the slices to the sink and brushed off every speck of dust or debris, treating them with a care that went beyond simple hygiene. Her movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if this small act of cleaning carried a significance that had nothing to do with the bread itself. She was washing away more than crumbs. She was washing away the humiliation of begging, the degradation of asking for scraps, the invisible grime that poverty leaves on everything it touches. The butter dish sat on the counter, the good butter that the family used, imported and expensive, and absolutely not meant for servants or street children. The maid didn't hesitate. She took a knife and spread a generous layer across each slice, watching it melt slightly into the warm bread, creating golden pools that caught the kitchen light. She worked with a precision that suggested years of practice, but also with a tenderness that had nothing to do with professional training. This wasn't a maid performing her duties. This was something else entirely, something that came from a deeper place. While the bread sat prepared on a clean plate, the maid moved to the stove where a kettle perpetually simmered. The family preferred their tea at specific temperatures, which meant keeping water hot throughout the day. She poured some into a cup, then added a tea bag, the good kind from the family's private collection, the blend that cost more per ounce than most people spent on a week of groceries. She let it steep properly, not rushing the process, adding a spoonful of honey and a splash of milk until the color was exactly right. The girl watched all of this with an expression that cycled through confusion, disbelief, and a fragile, dangerous hope. She'd been given food before, on the rare occasions when someone took pity on her, a handful of coins, a piece of fruit. Once, a half-eaten sandwich that someone thrust at her while hurrying past. But no one had ever prepared something for her like this. No one had ever treated her food as if it mattered, as if she mattered. The care in the maid's movements was almost overwhelming, and the girl found herself blinking rapidly, fighting back the threat of tears that would be humiliating to shed. When the maid finally set the plate and cup on the small servant's table near the door, she gestured for the girl to sit. The chair was simple but clean, and the girl approached it as if it might vanish if she moved too quickly. She lowered herself onto the edge of the seat, her posture rigid, her hands clasped in her lap. For a long moment she just stared at the food in front of her. The bread looked impossibly perfect, the butter gleaming, the steam rising from the tea creating delicate spirals in the air. It was the kind of meal she'd seen through restaurant windows, the kind that belonged to a world she could observe but never enter. The maid stood a few feet away, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, watching with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. When the girl still didn't move, the maid spoke softly, her voice carrying an unexpected gentleness. She told her to eat, that it was all right, that she didn't need to be afraid. The words were simple, but they carried a weight of permission that the girl desperately needed. She reached for the first slice with trembling fingers, lifting it as if it were made of glass. The first bite was small, cautious, her teeth closing around the bread with a delicacy that spoke of deep uncertainty. But the moment the taste registered, the moment the butter and the soft texture and the basic goodness of real food touched her tongue, something inside her cracked. She didn't devour it the way hunger should have demanded. Instead, she ate slowly, methodically, savoring each bite as if trying to memorize the sensation. She ate like someone who knew that good things were temporary, that this moment of abundance was an anomaly in a life defined by scarcity. Between bites, she sipped the tea, and the warmth of it seemed to travel through her entire body. She could feel it in her chest, in her stomach, spreading outward to fingers and toes that had been cold for so long she had forgotten what warmth felt like. Her shoulders, which had been hunched defensively since she arrived, began to relax incrementally. The tension that had been her constant companion started to ease, replaced by something unfamiliar and fragile. Safety, perhaps. Or the ghost of it. The maid watched every moment of this small transformation. She saw the way the girl's face softened, the way color began to return to her pale cheeks, the way her breathing deepened as her body finally allowed itself to believe that nourishment was real and present. There was something profound in witnessing this, something that went beyond simple charity or kindness. It felt like restoration, like a tiny piece of dignity being returned to someone who'd been systematically stripped of it. As the girl finished the last piece of bread and drained the final drops of tea, something shifted in the air between them. The maid had been patient, giving the child time to eat without pressure or interrogation, but now there was a question forming, one that had been building since the moment the girl first spoke. It hung in the space between them, heavy with implications that neither of them fully understood yet. The maid moved closer, pulling out the chair opposite the girl and sitting down slowly, deliberately placing herself at eye level rather than looming above. Her movements were careful, non-threatening, the kind of approach you'd use with a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden motion. She folded her hands on the table in front of her, and for the first time since the girl had arrived, she allowed her professional mask to slip entirely. What showed beneath it was raw and complex, a mixture of hope and fear and desperate need that transformed her face into something achingly human. And then the maid asked her a question no one had ever asked before. Not the police who'd occasionally moved her along from sleeping spots, not the shopkeepers who'd chased her from their doorways, not the rare kind strangers who'd offered a coin or a word of sympathy. No one had ever looked at her as if her answer actually mattered, as if she were a person with a history and an identity rather than just a problem to be solved or ignored. The question was simple, barely more than a handful of words, but it carried the weight of years and loss and a searching that had never quite ended. It hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and neither of them knew yet what lay on the other side. The words came out softer than the maid intended, barely more than a whisper that seemed too fragile for the weight it carried. She asked the girl what her name was, and the simplicity of the question belied the storm of emotion churning beneath it. It was the kind of question that should have been easy, the kind that strangers ask each other in passing without thinking twice. But nothing about this moment was ordinary, and the maid's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, betraying the carefully constructed calm she'd been trying to maintain. The girl looked up, surprised by the question. In her experience, people didn't ask her name. They called her girl or child or you there, or didn't address her at all. Names implied identity, personhood, a history that mattered. Most people who encountered her on the streets didn't want to know those things. Knowing her name would make her real, would make it harder to look away or justify their indifference. So the fact that this woman, this maid, who had already shown her more kindness than she'd experienced in months, wanted to know who she was, felt momentous in a way the girl couldn't quite articulate. She answered simply, without drama or hesitation, stating her name as if it were the most ordinary piece of information in the world. Her voice was quiet but clear, and she pronounced each syllable carefully, the way someone might who didn't get many opportunities to introduce themselves properly. It was just a name, common enough, nothing that should have caused any particular reaction. But the moment those syllables left her lips and traveled across the small space between them, everything changed. The maid's entire body went rigid. Every muscle locked simultaneously as if she'd been struck by lightning, and the color drained from her face so rapidly it was almost frightening. Her hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, suddenly clenched, fingers digging into the worn wood with enough force that her knuckles turned white. She wasn't breathing. For several long seconds, her chest simply stopped moving, and her eyes went wide with a shock so profound it bordered on physical pain. The girl noticed the reaction immediately and shrank back slightly, confused and suddenly worried that she'd done something wrong. Maybe the maid had known someone with that name who'd done something terrible. Maybe it was cursed somehow. Maybe she should have lied. But before she could apologize or take it back or do anything to fix whatever damage she'd accidentally caused, the maid sucked in a sharp breath and managed to force out another question. This one was even more difficult for her to speak, and her voice cracked halfway through asking it. She wanted to know where the girl's mother was. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and assumptions that the girl didn't understand. There was a desperation in the way the maid asked it, a rawness that suggested the answer mattered more than anything else in the world. Her eyes were fixed on the girl's face with an intensity that was almost unbearable, searching for something, waiting for confirmation of something she both desperately hoped for and deeply feared. The girl's response was casual, matter-of-fact, delivered with the kind of detachment that comes from years of accepting painful truths. She said she didn't know where her mother was. She'd been told that her mother had died when she was very small, too young to remember properly. There were fragments of memory, maybe, or maybe just stories she'd heard and convinced herself were real. A voice singing, hands that were gentle, the smell of something sweet, like flowers or perfume. But nothing concrete, nothing she could hold on to with certainty. She'd been passed between relatives who didn't want her, then to strangers who couldn't keep her, and eventually she'd ended up on the streets where at least the rejection was honest and straightforward. But then she added something, an afterthought that seemed insignificant to her but detonated in the space between them like a bomb. She mentioned a detail her mother had supposedly told someone before she died, a specific piece of information that had been passed down to the girl through the broken telephone of caregivers who hadn't cared enough to remember much else. It was something about where she'd been born, or a name her mother had wanted her to have but couldn't give her, or a place that had been important to their family. The exact nature of the detail mattered less than the fact that it was specific, unique, and impossible to fake or coincidentally stumble upon. The maid heard that detail, and something inside her shattered. This wasn't a similarity or a coincidence or a case of wishful thinking finding patterns where none existed. This was concrete. This was real. This was information that only a handful of people in the entire world could possibly know, and most of them were dead or disappeared, or had betrayed her so thoroughly that they'd never speak of it again. The probability of this child randomly knowing this detail, of it being anything other than what it appeared to be, was so infinitesimally small that denying it would require willful blindness. Her grip on the table tightened further, and the wood actually creaked under the pressure. She could feel her heart hammering so hard it hurt, each beat slamming against her ribs as if trying to break free. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps now, her body apparently having forgotten how to perform the basic function of breathing properly. The kitchen around her seemed to fade, the edges of her vision going slightly dark as all of her focus narrowed to the small girl sitting across from her. This child who had just spoken words that the maid had been waiting years to hear. She tried to process what this meant, tried to think through the implications logically, but her mind was chaos. Memories were flooding back, sharp and painful, and so vivid they felt more real than the present moment. She remembered other kitchens, other meals, other times when that name had been spoken with love and hope instead of casual indifference. She remembered plans that had been made, promises that had been broken, a moment when everything had been torn apart and she'd been powerless to stop it. She remembered searching the desperate months and years of following dead ends and false leads, of hoping and being disappointed so many times that hope itself had become a kind of torture. The girl was watching her with growing concern now, clearly frightened by the maid's reaction, but not understanding it. She'd lived her entire short life as an unwanted burden, someone whose very existence seemed to cause problems for everyone around her. This felt like more of the same, another adult reacting badly to something about her, another moment where she'd somehow managed to be wrong without understanding how. She started to stand, ready to leave, to disappear back into the streets where at least the rules made sense. And the rejection was predictable. But the maid's hand shot out faster than thought, not grabbing the girl but reaching toward her in a gesture that was half plea and half prevention. She managed to choke out a word, barely coherent, asking the girl to wait, to stay, to not leave yet. Her voice was thick with emotion, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, and the professional mask she'd worn for so many years had completely disintegrated. What remained was raw and vulnerable and desperately human. Because the name the girl had said, spoken so casually as if it meant nothing more than any other name, was a name the maid had been searching for. It was a name she'd whispered in the dark during countless sleepless nights. A name she'd given up hope of ever hearing spoken aloud again. A name that connected to memories of the most important person she'd ever lost. The one loss that had defined every choice she'd made for years. The one person she'd never stopped looking for, even when logic and reason told her it was hopeless. And now that name was sitting across from her, attached to a hungry child who had no idea she'd just walked into the middle of a story that had been unfinished for far too long. The maid's hands were shaking so violently now that she had to press them flat against the table to steady them. She looked at the girl, really looked at her, and the words that had been locked inside her for years began to force their way out. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke, each word carefully chosen because once they were said, there would be no taking them back. She told the girl that she wasn't just a maid, that this uniform and this role were not who she truly was, that everything the girl saw before her was a carefully constructed disguise meant to keep her hidden and safe. The girl stared back with wide, uncomprehending eyes as the maid continued. She explained that years ago, before the grey dress and the servants' quarters and the invisible existence in someone else's house, she had been someone else entirely. Someone with a name that meant something, a position that commanded respect, resources that seemed limitless. She had lived in houses like this one, not as staff, but as family, as someone who belonged in the grand rooms upstairs rather than the service areas below. She had worn fine clothes, attended important gatherings, made decisions that affected other people's lives. She had been part of a world that now seemed like a distant dream, so far removed from her current reality that sometimes she wondered if she'd imagined it all. But that life had been torn away from her through betrayal so profound, it had reshaped everything she understood about trust and family. She spoke carefully, aware that the girl was too young to understand all the complexities, but needing to explain anyway. There had been people she'd trusted, family members she'd believed would never harm her, who had decided that she was an obstacle to something they wanted. Money, power, control over assets and properties and legacies that had been built over generations. The details were complicated, involving legal manipulations and forged documents and lies that had been told so convincingly that even those who might have helped her had been turned against her. They had stolen everything from her, not just her wealth and her position, but her identity itself, her right to exist as the person she'd been born to be. They'd spread rumors that destroyed her reputation, produced evidence that made her look unstable or criminal or incompetent, used the systems that should have protected her to instead trap her in a web she couldn't escape. And the cruelest part, the thing that had broken her more completely than the loss of money or status, was that they'd taken the person she loved most in the world and made it impossible for her to reach them. The maid's voice cracked as she explained how she'd been forced into silence, threatened with consequences so severe that speaking up seemed more dangerous than disappearing. They'd made it clear that any attempt to reclaim her old life would result in harm not just to her but to others she cared about. So she'd done the only thing that made sense in that impossible situation. She'd vanished. She'd taken on a new identity, found work in places where people didn't ask too many questions about your past, and she'd waited and watched and searched, looking for any opportunity to find what had been taken from her, to reclaim what was rightfully hers, to protect the one person who mattered more than her own survival. She'd chosen this particular house deliberately, though it had taken her months to secure the position. It belonged to distant relatives of those who'd betrayed her, people connected to the network of wealth and influence that had been used against her. Working here gave her access to information, to conversations overheard in hallways, to documents left carelessly in studies, to the casual gossip of other staff members who knew things without understanding their significance. She'd been gathering evidence slowly, carefully, building a case that might one day be strong enough to overturn the lies that had been told about her. But more than that, she'd been searching for someone. The child who'd been taken from her, the daughter she'd been separated from through manipulation and legal theft, the girl she'd been told was lost forever. She'd followed every lead, investigated every rumor, checked orphanages and foster systems and any place a child might end up, when the people who should have cared for her decided she was inconvenient. Every door she'd knocked on, every dead end she'd encountered, had carved away another piece of her hope, until she'd almost convinced herself it was impossible. Now she looked at the girl sitting across from her, and she needed to be absolutely certain. Hope had betrayed her too many times before. She asked the girl, her voice trembling, if she would let her see the necklace, the cord she'd noticed earlier. The girl reached up hesitantly, pulling it out from beneath her collar. Hanging from the worn string was a small pendant, tarnished and dented from years of wear, but unmistakable. The maid pulled out her own necklace, one she'd kept hidden beneath her uniform all this time, and held them side by side. They were a matched set, two halves of a whole, designed to fit together in a way that left no room for doubt. Then she asked about marks, birthmarks specifically, and the girl pulled up her sleeve to reveal a distinctive shape on her inner forearm, a pattern that the maid had memorized long ago because she'd spent countless hours tracing it with gentle fingers during bedtimes and bath times, and all the small moments that make up a life together. The maid's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it perfectly, every curve and edge exactly as she remembered. Finally, almost without thinking, the maid began to hum. It was a melody she hadn't allowed herself to sing in years, a lullaby that had been private and precious, something she'd created for one specific child in a time that felt like another lifetime. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes suddenly sharp and focused in a way they hadn't been before. She knew that song. Somewhere in the deepest parts of her memory, in places she couldn't consciously access, that melody lived. And hearing it now in this kitchen with this woman who claimed to be someone other than a maid, something inside her recognized it as truth. The days that followed that kitchen revelation moved with a speed and precision that spoke of years of careful planning finally being put into action. The maid, who was no longer truly a maid at all, had spent countless hours preparing for a moment she'd barely dared to believe would come. She had documents hidden in places no one would think to look, evidence carefully gathered and preserved, testimonies from people who'd witnessed the betrayal but had been too afraid or too complicit to speak up at the time. She had names, dates, bank records, forged signatures, and a paper trail that, when assembled correctly, told a story of theft and manipulation that was impossible to deny. But she also knew that evidence alone wasn't enough. The people who'd stolen her life were powerful, connected, skilled at using the systems of law and society to protect themselves. They had money to hire the best lawyers, influence to sway judges and officials, and the kind of respectability that made their word carry weight, while hers would be dismissed as the desperate fabrication of a disgraced woman. So she'd waited, not just gathering proof, but waiting for the perfect moment, the exact set of circumstances that would make her case undeniable and her enemies vulnerable. Finding her daughter, having the physical proof of the child's existence and identity, was the final piece she'd needed. The girl wasn't just a person, she was living evidence of the lies that had been told. Her very existence contradicted the official story that had been constructed, the narrative that had allowed the betrayers to claim everything. They'd said the child was gone, lost, that the maid had been an unfit guardian whose instability had led to tragedy. But here was the girl alive and identifiable, bearing the marks and carrying the knowledge that proved she was exactly who the maid claimed her to be. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not the dramatic scene of a single moment, but rather a series of carefully orchestrated revelations that unfolded over several days. The maid began by contacting a lawyer she'd carefully vetted, someone young and hungry enough to take on a case that older, more established attorneys would have considered too risky or too complicated. She presented her evidence methodically, walking through every document, every piece of proof, building an airtight case that left no room for reasonable doubt. The lawyer's skepticism transformed into shock, then anger, then determination, as the full scope of the injustice became clear. Next came the authorities, though she was selective about who she approached. She'd learned through bitter experience that not everyone in positions of power could be trusted, that some were too easily bought or too invested in maintaining the status quo. But there were also those who still believed in justice, who were outraged by the abusive systems they'd sworn to uphold. She found those people, brought them her evidence, and watched as they began to understand that they'd been manipulated into enforcing a lie. The family who'd employed her, the wealthy household where she'd worked as a servant, became the staging ground for the most important confrontation. She'd known from the beginning that they were connected to those who'd betrayed her, distant cousins who'd benefited indirectly from her downfall, who'd attended parties and business meetings with the people who'd stolen her identity and her child. They'd never looked at her closely enough to recognize who she really was beneath the uniform, had never imagined that the quiet woman who cleaned their floors and served their meals was actually someone from their own social circle, someone they would have once greeted at galas and fundraisers. When investigators arrived at the house with questions, when lawyers began making inquiries, when the carefully constructed facade started to crack, the family finally looked at their maid with seeing eyes. The recognition, when it came, was almost comical in its shock. They'd lived alongside her for months, had spoken freely in her presence about business matters and family secrets, never once considering that she might understand the significance of what they were saying, or that she might be gathering every word for future use. Their comfortable assumption of her insignificance had made her the perfect spy in their midst. But the real confrontation came when those who'd orchestrated the original betrayal were finally forced to face what they'd done. They'd grown comfortable in their theft, had convinced themselves that enough time had passed to make them safe from consequences. They'd spent the money they'd stolen, had assumed the positions they'd manipulated their way into, had built lives on a foundation of lies that they'd told so often they'd started to believe them themselves. The emergence of evidence contradicting their story, the appearance of a child they'd claimed didn't exist, shattered their carefully maintained reality. The maid made sure she was present when they were confronted with the proof of their crimes. She wanted to see their faces when they realized that the invisible woman they'd dismissed, the desperate mother they'd crushed, had spent years preparing for this exact moment. She wanted them to understand that their arrogance had been their downfall, that their assumption that she would stay broken and silent had been a fatal miscalculation. She stood tall, no longer in uniform, but dressed in clothes that reflected her true station, her posture radiating the authority they'd tried to strip from her. The power dynamic that had been so carefully maintained, the hierarchy that had placed them above her and given them permission to destroy her life, flipped entirely. Suddenly, they were the ones scrambling to explain, to justify, to construct defenses that crumbled under the weight of evidence. Their lawyers, so confident at first, began to hedge and backtrack as they realized how damning the case against their clients truly was. The social circles that had embraced them, that had accepted their version of events without question, began to distance themselves as the truth emerged. Invitations were quietly withdrawn. Business partnerships were dissolved. The whispers that had once been directed at the maid now targeted those who'd betrayed her. Throughout all of this, the girl watched with wide eyes, trying to process the transformation happening around her. The woman she'd known as a kind maid was suddenly someone else entirely, someone who commanded rooms and made powerful people nervous, someone who spoke with authority and was listened to with respect. But more than that, she began to understand that all of this, the evidence and the lawyers and the confrontations, was happening because of her, because she mattered, because someone had spent years searching for her, refusing to give up, building toward this moment of reclamation and justice. For the first time in her life, the girl wasn't invisible. People looked at her not with pity or dismissal, but with recognition of her importance, her centrality to this story that was unfolding. She wasn't just a hungry child begging for bread. She was a daughter who'd been stolen, an heir who'd been deliberately hidden, a person whose very existence was significant enough to tear down the lies of powerful people. She had spent so long making herself small, trying not to be noticed, accepting invisibility as the price of survival. But now she was seen, truly seen, and the weight of that visibility was both terrifying and intoxicating. The consequences for those who'd betrayed them were severe and multifaceted. There were criminal charges for fraud and forgery, civil suits for the return of stolen assets, social disgrace that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But perhaps more devastating than any legal punishment was the complete destruction of the narrative they'd built. Their respectability, their reputation, their carefully crafted public image all collapsed as the truth emerged. They'd positioned themselves as pillars of their community, as people of integrity and honor, and now everyone could see that foundation was built on theft and cruelty and the deliberate harm of a woman and child who'd trusted them. The maid, standing in rooms where she was once again recognized as an equal, felt a satisfaction that went beyond simple revenge. This wasn't just about punishing those who'd hurt her, though that was certainly part of it. This was about reclaiming truth, about refusing to let lies define reality, about proving that justice, however delayed, was still possible. She'd spent years being told she was powerless, being treated as if her voice didn't matter, being forced to watch silently as others prospered from what they'd stolen. Now finally, the balance had been restored. Not perfectly, because some things couldn't be recovered and some time couldn't be returned. But enough. Enough to breathe again. Enough to rebuild. The first night in a real bed was almost too much for the girl to process. She lay perfectly still under clean sheets that smelled of lavender and soap, staring at the ceiling of a room that belonged to her, actually belonged to her, and couldn't quite believe it was real. She'd spent so long sleeping in doorways and alleys, curled up on cold concrete with nothing but cardboard for cushioning, that the softness of the mattress felt alien and overwhelming. Several times during that first night she woke in panic, convinced she'd been dreaming, that she'd open her eyes to find herself back on the streets with nothing but the memory of warmth to torture her. But each time she woke, the room was still there, solid and real, and hers. The transformation happened in layers, each one revealing something that had been buried under the grime and desperation of survival. The first real bath she took lasted over an hour, the water turning grey as months of street living washed away. Her mother, because she was learning to think of the woman as her mother again, even though the word still felt strange in her mouth, sat nearby with clean towels and gentle soap, patient as the girl scrubbed at skin she'd almost forgotten could be clean. When she finally emerged, wrapped in softness and warmth, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the face looking back. Without the layers of dirt, her features were delicate, her eyes bright, her skin several shades lighter than she'd thought it was. The clothes came next, and they were nothing like what she'd imagined rich people wore. Her mother didn't dress her in fancy gowns or uncomfortable formal wear. Instead, she chose soft cotton shirts and comfortable pants, simple dresses that moved easily, shoes that fit properly and didn't pinch or rub. Each item was selected with care, and her mother explained as she helped her try things on that comfort mattered more than appearance, that she should never have to wear something that made her feel trapped or restricted. The girl ran her hands over the fabric, marveling at the texture, at the absence of holes and stains, and that particular stiffness that comes from clothes that have been worn too long without washing. Food became a different experience entirely. The first few days her stomach couldn't handle much, shrunken as it was from months of irregular eating and poor nutrition. Her mother worked with a doctor to develop a careful plan, gradually increasing portions and variety as her body adjusted to consistent nourishment. But even those small meals were revelations. Fresh fruit that burst with flavor, vegetables cooked in ways that made them actually taste good, proteins that satisfied in ways that scraps and garbage never had. She learned that food could be about more than just stopping hunger, that it could be enjoyable, something to look forward to rather than just a desperate need to fill an empty space. But the most profound changes were the ones that couldn't be seen. The constant anxiety that had been her companion for so long began to ease, replaced gradually by something that felt almost like security. She stopped flinching at sudden movements, stopped calculating escape routes from every room she entered, stopped hoarding food in her pockets in case this abundance suddenly disappeared. She began to sleep through the night without waking in panic. She started to relax her shoulders, to lift her eyes from the ground, to take up space without apologizing for her existence. Her mother watched these transformations with a mixture of joy and grief. Joy at seeing her daughter bloom back into the person she'd been meant to be all along. Grief at all the years of suffering that showed in every hesitant gesture and fearful glance. She made sure the girl knew that this wasn't temporary, that this wasn't charity that could be withdrawn. She had legal documents drawn up, official papers that proved their relationship, that established the girl's rights and identity beyond any possible challenge. She wanted her daughter to understand that she was safe now, truly safe, in ways that went beyond just having a roof and regular meals. One evening, several weeks after that first meeting in the kitchen, her mother called her to the dining room for dinner. Not the kitchen table where servants ate, but the formal dining room with its long, polished table and comfortable chairs. The girl entered hesitantly, still not quite comfortable in these grand spaces, still feeling like she might break something or do something wrong. But her mother was already seated, and she gestured to the chair beside her with a warm smile that had become more frequent as the days passed. On the table sat a simple meal, nothing extravagant or complicated, but prepared with care and served on proper dishes. And there, on a small plate in front of the girl's setting, were 3 slices of bread with butter, exactly like the ones that had been given to her that first day. The girl stared at them for a long moment, memories flooding back of standing at a kitchen door, desperate and hungry, and convinced she was nothing more than a burden on the world. Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand gently, understanding without words what the girl was feeling. She told her that she wanted to remember that moment, not because it was painful, but because it was the moment everything changed, the moment they found each other again after years of separation and searching. She explained that the bread wasn't just bread anymore. It was a symbol of where they'd been and how far they'd come, of the difference between begging for scraps and sitting at a table as someone who belonged. The girl picked up a slice, and this time when she bit into it, there was no fear that it might disappear, no need to eat quickly before it could be taken away. She could taste it properly now, could appreciate the simple goodness of it without desperation clouding every sensation. She was sitting at a table in clean clothes, in a warm house, with someone who loved her. The contrast to that day in the kitchen was so stark, it almost didn't seem real. Yet here she was, living proof that transformation was possible. What began as a plea for old bread became the start of a new life, a life where she didn't have to be invisible to survive, where her needs were anticipated rather than dismissed, where she could begin to imagine a future that extended beyond just making it through another day. The journey from that desperate child at a kitchen door to this girl sitting at a family table was more than just a physical transformation. It was a reclamation of dignity, a restoration of hope, and a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can set in motion changes that reshape entire lives. Months passed, and the house that had once been a place of servitude and disguise transformed into something that felt like home. The girl, who was no longer quite so thin or quite so frightened, stood at the window of her room one afternoon, watching children play in the street below. She thought about the person she'd been, that desperate child who'd knocked on kitchen doors begging for scraps, and felt as if she were remembering a character from a story rather than her own lived experience. The distance between who she'd been and who she was becoming felt vast, almost impossible to bridge in her mind, yet here she was, proof that such transformations were real. Her mother found her there, standing in the golden afternoon light, and came to stand beside her. They'd developed a comfortable silence between them, the kind that comes from genuine connection rather than the absence of things to say. Her mother had been teaching her things, not just practical skills like reading and writing and mathematics, though those were important too. She'd been teaching her about dignity, about self-worth, about the idea that every person carried value regardless of their circumstances or their past. These were lessons the girl absorbed slowly, fighting against years of conditioning that had taught her the opposite. They talked sometimes about that day in the kitchen, about the moment everything changed. Her mother confessed that she'd been close to giving up, that after years of searching with nothing to show for it, she'd begun to wonder if hope itself was just another form of self-torture. She'd been working in that house, gathering her evidence and building her case, but part of her had stopped believing she'd ever find what she was looking for. And then there her daughter was, standing at the door asking for bread with a voice that cracked in ways that echoed through time and memory. The girl admitted that she'd almost not stopped at that house. She'd been so tired that day, so worn down by rejection and hunger and the endless effort of survival that she'd nearly walked past. The house had looked too grand, too intimidating, too far above her station for her to dare approach. But something had pulled her toward that kitchen door, some instinct she couldn't name that told her to try one more time. She liked to think now that maybe some part of her had recognized something, had sensed a connection that her conscious mind couldn't yet process. Maybe fate existed after all, working in ways too subtle to notice until you looked back and saw the pattern. Her mother pulled her close, holding her with a fierceness that still sometimes surprised the girl, though she was learning to accept it, even to crave it. She whispered that she'd never let her go again, that no one would ever have the power to separate them or hurt them the way they'd been hurt before. The girl believed her now in a way she hadn't been able to at first. Trust was something that had to be rebuilt slowly, brick by careful brick, but the foundation was solid now, strong enough to support the weight of a future they were building together. They'd started giving back in their own way. Her mother had used some of the reclaimed assets to establish a fund for children in situations similar to what her daughter had endured. They worked with shelters and social services, trying to create systems that would prevent other children from falling through the cracks the way she had. The girl sometimes helped, sharing her perspective, explaining what had made her feel invisible and what small kindnesses had mattered most. She was learning that her experience, as painful as it had been, could be transformed into something meaningful, could help others who were still living the nightmare she'd escaped. One evening, as they sat together in what had become their favorite spot, a small sitting room with comfortable chairs and soft lighting, her mother said something that would stay with the girl for the rest of her life. She talked about how easy it is to overlook people, to let them fade into the background of our awareness until they become invisible, the servants we don't really see, the homeless people we step around without making eye contact, the children who exist on the margins of society, too poor or too troubled or too inconvenient to warrant our full attention. She said that we do this because seeing them fully, acknowledging their humanity and their struggles, would require us to feel uncomfortable things. It would demand action or at least acknowledgement of our own privilege and the systems that create such disparities. So we develop a kind of selective blindness, a way of looking past rather than at, of dismissing rather than engaging. We tell ourselves stories that make their invisibility acceptable, that suggest they're somehow less deserving or less important than the people we do choose to see. But the danger in this, she continued, is that we never know who we're overlooking or what we might be missing. The person serving our coffee might be a former executive rebuilding after catastrophic loss. The child begging on the corner might be someone's stolen daughter. The quiet employee we barely notice might be gathering evidence that will eventually hold us accountable for our actions. Sometimes, the people we overlook, the ones we've decided aren't worth our full attention, are the very ones holding our future in their hands. Her mother looked at her daughter then with eyes that held both sadness and hope, reflecting on all they'd lost and all they'd found. She said that this story, their story, was about more than just their reunion or their reclaimed justice. It was a reminder that every person we encounter carries a universe of experience and possibility within them, and that the moment we decide someone is invisible, we risk missing something profound. Sometimes the most important connections, the ones that will change everything, come from the places and people we least expect, if only we're willing to truly see them. Sometimes, the people we overlook are the very ones holding our future, And if we're fortunate, we realize this before it's too late, before the moment passes and the connection is lost forever. They had been lucky, mother and daughter both, to find each other again despite all the forces working against them. Not everyone got that chance, but maybe, if enough people started really seeing the invisible ones around them, fewer chances would be lost, fewer lives would slip through the cracks, and fewer children would have to beg for bread at kitchen doors before someone finally recognized them for who they truly were.